All right, you guys. So today we're going to be talking about supercritical CO2 cycles, and it's going to be presented by Jashawn, Jonathan, and Matthew. And so you may wonder, what are supercritical CO2 power cycles? So these power cycles are using CO2 at a supercritical state as a working fluid instead of water or steam. And so usually in power plants, they're going to be using water or steam to be firing these cycles. And that has worked well for years, but people just look to make these cycles more and more efficient. And so a new way they have gone about this is by using CO2 in a supercritical state, which is shown in this area of this diagram. And so as it says here, it is above the critical point, which is both higher in pressure and higher in temperature. And so that gets the CO2 into the supercritical state, which is more effective in power cycles and is able to produce more work. All right, and so now to some advantages of the supercritical CO2 power cycles. So as I kind of stated earlier, these are effective, or the CO2 is effective at a broader range of temperatures. And so because of this, it's going to yield a higher efficiency. And so as shown here is the efficiency equation. And so if you can imagine this, the higher the difference in your high and low temperature, then the higher this efficiency will be, since it is 1 minus that ratio there. And CO2 or supercritical CO2 is also very energy dense. And so because of this, as it says here, the plants can be much smaller because of the supercritical CO2 being more compact. And so you don't have to have near as large a machinery, pipes, turbines, compressors, etc. All of it can be smaller. And so because of this, you're going to be using less metal, and so the cost of materials will go down. This supercritical CO2 is also non-explosive, non-flammable, and non-toxic, which is clearly much safer and easier to deal with. Not as many safety precautions have to be put in place. And also, it is going to have much lower emissions because you can pull in some of the CO2 from the atmosphere and not worry about emitting more greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels and other types of power plants that we have today. And so, once again, I stated this, cheaper than alternatives. That also kind of goes back to the cost of materials, as well as not having to just buy the raw fossil fuels.
All right, so one of the main types of supercritical CO2 cycles is the direct fired Brayton cycle, which utilizes direct heating by fuel combustion. So here's a diagram of, it's basically just a regular Brayton cycle with a few extra things added in. So start off, the CO2 goes through the line, is fuel enters in, is combusted, oxygen's added in as well. That brings the heat up, which generates power through the turbine. It's cooled down. And down here, since we're adding in this oxygen, that's actually going to create some water in the line. And so since we want pure CO2, what we can do is cool it down so that the steam that gets in there turns back into water, and you'll have some kind of water collection system that will get that out so that you can just have pure CO2. And the reason this works, and it's really nice actually, is because the vaporization point for CO2 is a lot lower than water. So when you cool down the whole mixture, the CO2 will stay as a gas while the steam turns into liquid. And so a nice thing about this too is, since you have this CO2, instead of like putting it out as exhaust as greenhouse gases, the CO2 you can actually just reuse because that's your working fluid. And if you have extra CO2, you can pump it out into storage or a pipeline or something. You could sell it or just save it for future use. And so a couple advantages, I kind of already touched on some, but one that I didn't touch on yet is that the combustion, since we're doing a direct firing, the combustion actually provides a higher temperature at the turbine inlet, which means it's more efficient. Like Matthew talked about earlier, the higher temperature, the the higher temperature difference results in more energy generation. The CO2 is reused instead of expelled, like I talked about earlier, less greenhouse gas. One of the only disadvantages I can really think of for this is that you have to integrate some kind of water collection system, which is going to drive up your cost.
So this is the indirectly fired SCO2 Brayton cycle. It's basically the directly fired SCO2 cycle, apart from this one minor change of the heat exchanger being included, where your working fluid, the SCO2, is reheated or is heated and reheated using an external heat source like steam, which passes through this heat exchanger and acts as a reheating mechanism. Basically, the purpose of the indirectly fired cycle is to provide more efficiency by reusing the same working fluid and reheating it using that heat exchanger, and mainly the steam that is used to heat that working fluid. Usually, companies try to utilize industrial power plant steam, that's excess steam that comes out of their process, and use that as the main heating mechanism, so as to not need more energy. So the indirectly fired Brayton cycle is separate, as I said, because it uses an external heat source, and the working fluid passes through the turbine in that superheated state. Then it cools down via gas cooling, and then it enters the compressor again, so the cycle can repeat. The indirect fired Brayton cycle is also in the form of a recuperated closed Brayton cycle, which just means that you reheat the same working fluid. It could be CO2, it could be steam, and you repeat the process over and over again, so you don't have to have more working fluid or attempt to find more working fluid. So the pros of the recuperated closed loop Brayton cycle, which includes the recompressors, which one may include the recompressors or one may not, but the heat exchanger allows for the recovery of heat lost by the working fluid during the carbon dioxide cooling. So it increases the efficiency of the cycle, so you don't have to add extra fluid or worry about adding any extra kind of heat. It's a cycle that's basically made of fluids that are excess off of other reactions. And the inclusion of a recompressor is also an advantage because it increases the recuperation efficiency by 5%, according to an article by Zhu. And using excess heat from the steam of an industrial power plant, as I said, like they're using this in Ohio, they can be used to effectively generate that electric work without using any other steam, without worrying about where the steam's going to come from. You can just use it from the power plant. Some cons would be that significant reheating can cause the pressure in the cycle to increase with heat increase, and thus they could lead to the CO2 reaching its critical point, which can cause inefficiencies. The recuperated recompression processes require an additional recompressor, which can be costly to the overall scope of the project. So you might want to avoid additional recompressors, even though they might give you more efficiency. Then you would have to do a cost to benefit ratio to see what would be best for your project.
All right, so wrapping up here with the real world applications. So these cycles are still kind of a work in progress, but they have definitely taken a stand in some power plants. And so as this fun set fact down here says, a lot of these first power plant cycles using the supercritical CO2 are actually in Texas. There's been a few companies that have implemented it into their power plants, but it has not completely taken over yet. You know, it's still in development, but I could also see it working in fossil fuel systems and also some heat exchangers. All right, and here are our references that we've used for the entire project. And here is our headshots. Thank you.